All right, we're in 2 Kings 18. 2 Kings 18, we'll pick up in verse 19. So we're looking at a significant portion of the Kings in that the amount of time that's dedicated to it. That tells us something about what the narrator is wanting us to know and to understand. And so as at this point, the 10 northern tribes are gone into captivity, and now the 2 southern tribes look as if they might go because of the invasion of Assyria. And so we're under King Hezekiah. We were introduced to his reign last week. He's spoken of very highly for his trust in God and his removal of the idolatrous high places and a number of different things. Now what we're getting into now is the Assyrian invasion as it comes back down to the people of Judah. This is his third campaign. In his career, his reign, he will have 8 of them. This is the third one. As we said, he's already got 200,000 captives, 46 fortified cities, and so he is just basically rolling like a freight train and just snatching up any place and every place. And so let's just back up to 13 and read down to 19 to kind of put ourselves back in the situation, and then we'll move forward with the discussion that takes place. It says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria in Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. You remember that was part of him. He's an anti-Assyrian. That's kind of been a marker for a number of kings. Are you pro-Assyrian? Are you anti-Assyrian? He's anti-Assyrian. It says, the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and the treasury of the king's house. At that time, Hezekiah stripped the gold from off the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorposts that Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. Now, this is a moment of weakness for him. This is not normal for him. He's known and praised in the first part of this chapter for his trust, but on this occasion, he's not trusting. He's doing what all the other kings in previous times that had not trusted God, what they did. He's raiding the temple in order to pay an oppressor to go away instead of trusting God to deliver him. So in verse 17, it says, and the king of Assyria sent the Tartan and the Rabsaris, and these are leading officials. The Tartan is the supreme commander. The Rabsaris is the chief officer, is what that title means. These are not names, they're titles. The Rabshakeh, who is the field commander, and he's going to be the main speaker here in just a minute, with a great army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. And so they're having a show of power, a show of force. And it says, and they went and came up to Jerusalem. And when they arrived, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is on the highway of the washer's field. And we talked about that significance with Isaiah 7. Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah, his idolatrous ways and the choice that he made not to trust God. And now his son Hezekiah gets the same choice at the same location, although he is going to pass the test that his father failed. And so in verse 18, when they called for the king, there came out Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna the secretary, and Joah the son of Asaph the recorder. And so what you've got is a meeting of representatives of the kings. The kings themselves, obviously, are not meeting. Now, we'll be able to move somewhat swiftly through these next verses because it's dialogue, okay? But there are some words to pay attention to throughout as we read and pause along the way. And those are the words trust and deliver. Trust and deliver, okay? Now, before we launch into this too far, I want to explain why those are important. When it comes to studying the Old Testament, this is a culture that was, you have to remember, bookmaking and people owning copies of books, even the common man, is a really new phenomenon in the history of the world. We've talked about this plenty of times before. The way that they interacted with the Word of God on most occasions was they heard it read to them. And so there are things that they're trying to do to help the person who is hearing solidify a thought in their mind. I read one of my friend's PhD seminar papers that he's writing on this right now in the Old Testament. And he was talking about this very point, how that it's an oral culture. And so there are word plays that we miss in English that are there in Hebrew. They're rhymes, they're puns, they're all different types of things because you're trying to put it to them in ways that they can hear and remember, because they can't take notes really, and they don't own a copy of it. So you've got to find a way to keep communicating. Now, this is one of the, I'm not even going to say problems, it's one of the, setback for maybe a better term, of modern translations many times. Because modern translations are based many times how they choose their wording. For example, especially in Hebrew, you've got multiple words. But in English literature and English composition, we are taught not to be repetitive with words in a discussion. Okay, if I use it in this sentence, I need to use a synonym in the next sentence and a third synonym in the third sentence and so forth. Okay? But you have to remember, that's for a written culture. We're a written culture. We read. When you have an oral culture, you use the same term over and over and over and over and over and over so people get the point. Okay? So, sometimes in modern translations, it can be the exact same Hebrew word or Greek word, but our translators will give us synonyms because that's the way we like to hear it. But that's not the way necessarily that God communicated it. And so there's kind of a cultural bump we kind of have to get over as we work through this. And so this is one of those texts, though, where the text has remained pretty faithful to the words that are being used, where you've got trust and deliver. Okay? So here's the Rabshakeh. Again, he's the field commander. He said to them, "Say to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, on what do you rest this trust of yours? Do you think that mere words are a strategy and power for war? In whom do you trust that you have rebelled against me?" Okay? So he starts off with the insult, playing a very strong hand. What are you resting your trust on? Mere words are not a strategy. What he's saying is trying to strong-arm me and talk big and use inflammatory speech. That's not a strategy, because at the end of the day, what matters is when the forces collide, right? That's why I always say when it comes to athletics, a lot of coaches are all about rah-rah. You know, get them pumped up. You know, that works really well until you get hit in the mouth. Then it's got to be about discipline. It's got to be about execution, okay? And so he's saying something similar along those lines. Anybody can mouth off something. It's another thing to actually be able to follow through with it. And so what he's telling him is, this is not a strategy. Popping off is not a strategy. And so he says, in whom do you now trust that you have rebelled against me? Behold, and so he starts going through a number of options he might be trusting in. Behold, you are trusting now in Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of anyone who leans upon it, such as Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trust in him. This has been a message all throughout the prophets, Isaiah 30, Isaiah 31. They are looking to the Assyrian, or they're looking to different countries to align themselves with to help keep Assyria off of their back. God had already told them, you're not supposed to do that. You simply trust me, I'll take care of everything else. So they're going to Egypt, and actually Hezekiah doesn't go to Egypt. He's just assuming that because that's what the king of the north did in chapter 17. But he's saying, if you try and lean upon Pharaoh, king of Egypt, it's like a broken reed. Okay? And reed here has reference to a papyrus reed that grows. We got papyrus was a normal sheet of paper writing mechanism. It's not very strong. It's kind of like some really strong stubble, really. He's saying that's what you're leaning on. Or you might say if somebody is trying to build a house on a foundation of styrofoam, it's not going to work. And furthermore, it's like a reed that you're going to pierce your hand, that even if you try and lean and put your pressure on like a walking stick of this thing, it's going to penetrate your hand. You're going to cut your hand on it. And so it's actually going to be the reverse of what you think you're getting. You're actually going to harm yourself even more by getting into alliance with the king of Egypt, because he can't be trusted. And so if you're trying to do that, that's a waste of time as well. Then in verse 22, he says this, "But if you say to me, 'We trust in the Lord our God,' is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, 'You shall worship before the altar in Jerusalem'?" Now here he is, he's communicating something to a degree that's right, but at the same time completely wrong. Is it true that Hezekiah had taken out high places? Yes. Were those high places dedicated to God? No. They were dedicated to idols. And so what you have is a person who's misrepresenting reality. Okay? It's like when a person stands up and they say, "I'm an ex-Christian, so I can tell you what Christianity is about." No, you can't. An ex-Christian doesn't mean that you ever understood Christianity the first time. But those are the ones in exposés that everybody wants to listen to. "I'm an ex-so-and-so, so I can tell you all about that." No, you can't. That doesn't make you qualified to talk about that. And so here he starts talking. God is going to, your God surely is mad at you because you removed all these high places. Actually, the reverse is true. God is very pleased with Hezekiah because he removed all the high places and said, "You have to worship in Jerusalem." But you have somebody who doesn't really know what he's talking about, and he's running his mouth, and he's trying to intimidate people, and he ends up being absolutely wrong in his interpretation of the events. So in 23, he says, "Come now and make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give you 2,000 horses if you are able to put riders on them." Now remember, they've taken all the defense cities of Judah back up in the earlier parts of the text, and that means places where you would have soldiers stationed. So they're depleted as far as soldiers. And that's what he's saying. Even if my master gave you 2,000 horses, let's say we'll spot you 2,000. I think about playing basketball as a kid, and you get out there and you're like, "Okay, we're going to play 21. I'll spot you 17. You're usually doing that because you're not worried about it. Okay? So that's kind of what he's doing. He's the overwhelming favorite. I'll give you 2,000 horses, but you can't put riders on them. You are that depleted, you don't have a chance. He says, "How then can you repulse a single captain among the least of my master's servants when you trust in Egypt for chariots and for horsemen?" Again, he's assuming that they're going to Egypt. They have not. "Moreover, is it without the Lord that I have come up against you to this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, 'Go up against this land and destroy it.'" Now, this is another one of those statements that you kind of have to wade through a little bit. Was God using Assyria to punish certain nations? Yes. That's a lot of what the prophets and a lot of the Old Testament is about. God uses nations to punish other nations. That's something our founders said in some of their early documents, that they were spot on when they spoke it. And they said that God judges empires in history, but he judges people in eternity. He judges empires in history and people in eternity. That is, you have nations being toppled, and a good portion of that has to do with God's judgment upon that nation. That's not an absolute case in every place. You have dictators, you have despots, you have some of those things that that are a little bit murky to kind of wade through. But individuals are ultimately judged finally individually. And so God uses wicked, and the way that he does it, this is all about what Habakkuk's 3 chapters are about. Habakkuk says to God, "I want you to punish or to remove all the wickedness from Israel." And God says, "I'm going to, but you're not going to like my answer." And he says, "I'm going to bring the Babylonians, and they're going to destroy Jerusalem and everything else." And Habakkuk says, "Now wait a minute, that's not fair. They're more wicked than we are." And God said, "Yes, that's how I operate. I use a nation more wicked than the nation that I'm destroying, and when they're done doing what I want them to do, I use a nation more wicked than them to destroy them." That's how he operates. So is the Syrian envoy, are they resting upon, is God using them? Yes. but not in the way they think. Isaiah 10 talks about how they think that it's about their power and their might, that they're the ones that are doing this, when God is the one who's pulling the strings in the heavens, and they're just basically puppets in the game. So he says, God, your God sent me here to destroy you. Maybe. So then in verse 26, it says, Then Eliakim the son of Hilkiah and Shebna and Joah said to the Rabshakeh, Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall. So obviously, a lot of people are watching. Everybody knows this is going down. So they're overhearing the conversation. The Rabshakeh is not talking to them in a small voice saying, okay, I think we can work this out. You need to stop trusting in the wrong people, and we can. He's yelling it out because he's not really worried about intimidating the leaders, but he knows if he can intimidate the people may do the job of getting the leaders to do what he wants them to do. Okay? And so there's more than one way to skin that cat. You just go around it. Now they say, please speak to us in Aramaic. Aramaic was one of the official languages of international diplomacy. It's similar to Hebrew. As a matter of fact, parts of the Old Testament are written in Aramaic. A good section of Daniel is Aramaic. It's one of the Semitic tongues. But the normal people at that time would not have understood Aramaic. To kind of put it in perspective, it does become pretty popular. It's most commonly believed Jesus and the disciples spoke Aramaic. That people in Israel at the time of Christ would have spoken Aramaic. And so it becomes popular, but it is not popular right now. So they're saying, don't speak in a different language so they can't understand you, because we don't want them to get scared. But the Rabshakeh said to them, Has my master sent me to you to speak words to your master and to you, and not to the men sitting on the wall, who are doomed with you to eat their own dung and to drink their own urine? He's not being dramatic. That's what happens in besieging. We've been through this. Chapter 6, 24 and 25. They went through this. They were selling, they were selling dung to be eaten. When you besiege a city, your goal, even if you never penetrate the walls, your goal is basically to starve them out until they give up. And that's not something that they did just then. That was, I'm sure it probably still happens in certain places now, but that's as old as the Battle of Vicksburg in the Civil War. Or as recent as that. So what the Rabshakeh is saying is, no, I won't be quiet, because they're the ones, you're making a decision that's going to affect all them, and they're the ones, you're royalty, so you'll always have your food supply. I'm worried, I'm trying to reach the people who aren't going to have all that food supply. And so what he's doing is psychological warfare, okay? And all warfare is psychological in nature. You use it. That's why when the Allies began to move into Europe, Hitler would still broadcast that they were losing in certain places and all these different types of things. It was a shadow game. They weren't losing, but he thought if I could just break their morale, if they think they're losing, then maybe they've lost. So it's not an old strategy. It's one that's been around for quite some time. So that's where he is. And so now he's going to continue this discussion, and he's going to, from this point forward, talk to the people who are listening, saying, I'm going to come to you directly and give you an offer. It says, Then the Rabshakeh stood and called out in a loud voice in the language of Judah, Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand. Do not let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord by saying, The Lord will surely deliver us, and this city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, Make your peace with me and come out to me. Then each of you will eat from his own vine, and each one of his own fig, and each one of you will drink water out of his own cistern, until I come and take you to a land like your own land, a land of grain and wine, and a land of bread and vineyards and olive trees and honey, that you may live and not die. And do not listen to Hezekiah. He misleads you by saying, The Lord will deliver us. So he goes to them with a deal. All right? The deal is, if you agree to surrender, you'll get to stay in your homeland for actually quite a while, because it will take time to work out the logistics of transporting you places. Okay? He says, each one of you will eat of his own vine and of his own fig tree. That's reminiscent of 1 Kings 4:25 under the ease of life that everyone enjoyed in the days of Solomon. And so I'm going to give you a good life, and I'm going to take you to a land just like yours, and your life will be easy. You won't have to go through all this. The only problem is he's lying. You don't trust dictators. You don't trust them. There's a little book, and by little I mean like that maybe, less than 100 pages, by Andy Andrews, called How Do You Kill 11 Million People? It's about the Holocaust. How do you kill 11 million people? You lie to them. You see, everybody thinks that the Holocaust was just the final solution portion of it, where it was time to just kill all of them in a mass murder because they knew they were losing the war. That's only a small portion of the Holocaust. He had been killing them long before that. It was just a final effort to cover up his war crime. And Andrews talks about in his book what he told Jews early on in conquered places was he told them, I'm going to, you've been persecuted where you are, so we're just going to take you by train and we're going to move you to a different location where it's safer for you. You'll have plenty to eat, plenty to drink, all these types of things. And he would lead them out there and he would slaughter them. How do you kill 11 million people? You lie to them. That's all this man is doing right. He's lying to them. He doesn't have any intention, and he does not have their best interest at heart. He is not someone who is acting in good faith. So then he goes on to say this, when he's saying, don't believe Hezekiah, don't trust God. He says, have any of the gods of the other nations ever delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? So what's his argument? What's his argument? You got to remember, warfare for them is not just warfare on earth, it's a warfare in the heavens. It's one God versus the other. And that's why when a nation conquers another nation, you also raid that nation's chief deity's temple, and you transport the goods from that temple to the temple of your deity. The same thing that Nebuchadnezzar is going to do in the opening chapter of Daniel. It was a way of saying, you conquered this God, and I'm going to bring you the loot from this God and set it in your house because you're more powerful than he is. So he says, nobody has beaten me yet. And you know what's amazing to me is the amount of arguments that people make similar to this, and people listen to it and they're like, yeah, that's good reasoning. No, it isn't. It's awful. That doesn't mean anything. Nobody's beaten me yet. So? That's like a person jumps off a building that's 50 stories and 30 stories down. He said, I'm still alive and going good, buddy. Well, you just wait. It's coming for you. When I read this and other accounts like it, it really bothers me because I see the same type of reasoning that exists amongst so many people. And people just sit back, and Christians sit back and they lap it in. And I just, good grief, I get the point. But people just lap it in like, oh, this is great. Listen, it's one thing to get caught up in the giftedness of an individual who's trying to teach you something or trying to persuade you of something. It's another thing to sit down and remove your emotions and really put that thing under the microscope and really think about what they're saying. And is it lining up with reality? Is there another way of looking at it? Is there a side of the argument that they're not showing me? And that's why when it comes to kids and teaching them, that's down their hallway, that's not mine. Sometimes people ask, we only have so long to teach our kids. If you could teach them anything, what would you teach them? The one thing that I'm the most concerned about, and this is just me, and I'm no parenting expert, and like I've told you before, if you come across a parenting expert, don't listen to them. They don't know. You can get general ideas, but everything is peculiar. Everything is odd. You cannot speak in generalities the way that some of these people do. But if there was one thing I could teach them, I would teach them to think correctly. To not just take something because somebody is telling it to you, but to actually know how to think through things. If we can learn to think through things, we can find the truth every time. But we got to know how to think. And so it becomes extremely important for us. So we'll pick up there next week and move into Hezekiah's response, and then there will be another response from the king of Assyria, and then finally God's final response to the whole situation.